Today we have the opportunity to hear about the views and vision of two citizens, one for and one against instituting a sales tax for the state. Today they will address this issue particularly as it relates to Ballot Measure 1, which will be on our November 9th statewide ballot. The City Club also has recently completed one of its well-known research reports on this ballot measure. As I mentioned, that report will be presented to the membership and voted on at our Friday forum next week, November 5th. Speaking in favor of Ballot Measure 1 is Ozzie Rose, Executive Director of the Confederation of Oregon School Administrators in Salem. A former high school math teacher, Rose has a PhD in school administration from the University of Oregon. He's been Executive Director of COSA since 1974. Bill Sizemore will represent the anti-sales tax forces. He is Director of Oregon Taxpayers United and Executive Director of the group's Political Action Committee. A former businessman and toy manufacturer, Sizemore is one of the chief petitioners of a ballot measure which would require state employees to contribute to their PERS pensions. He lives in Gresham. Today's program will have several sections. First, each speaker will give a 7-minute opening statement. We'll begin with Ozzie Rose, who will speak in favor of the sales tax. He will be followed immediately by Bill Sizemore, who will speak against the sales tax. The order of questions will alternate in this manner throughout the debate. Following the opening statements then, our speakers will ask 2 questions of each other. Each speaker will have 15 seconds to ask the question, the respondent will have 1 minute to answer, and the questioner will have an optional 30-second rebuttal. Following the cross questions, we'll have a series of questions from our City Club panel. Our questioners today are members of the program committee. Joanne Allen, Community Partnership Specialist for Multnomah County Chair Bev Stein, and Dr. Frances Storrs, Professor of Dermatology at Oregon Health Sciences University. Questions were submitted in advance of the meeting in writing by members of the City Club, and then a special committee from the program committee selected the questions for today. The speakers have not seen the questions in advance. Each candidate will have 1 minute to respond to the question. Our timer, seated in front today, is Jolene Clausen, Neighborhood Coordinator for Neighbors North-Northwest, also for our program committee. After the panel questions, we will entertain questions from the floor from City Club members. Questions from the floor must be asked in 15 seconds, and then speakers will have 1 minute to respond. Both questions and answers will be timed. If you have a question for the pro-sales tax speaker, whether or not you're for or against, but for the pro-sales tax speaker, please line up to the microphone at my right. If you have a question for the anti-sales tax speaker, please line up for the microphone to my left. Following the questions from the floor, each speaker will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. This meeting is governed by the program format I have described and by the rules of conduct which are displayed in all of your tables. The program will adjourn at 1:15 p.m. I would now like to ask each speaker to approach their podiums, and we will begin with opening statements. We'll begin with an opening statement by Ozzie Rose, followed by Bill Sizemore.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the audience. Good afternoon. As noted, I'm Ozzie Rose, and I do work for the Confederation of Oregon School Administrators. My wife and I are the parents of 3 grown children who have benefited from Oregon's public school system and graduated from the University of Oregon. Go Ducks. We are also the parents of a 10-year-old 4th grader in the Salem school system, whom we hope will have the same opportunities his older brothers and sisters have had in Oregon. I have been a participant in the school funding and tax debate in Oregon for the past 20 years, and I'm here to ask you to support our schools and the economic future of our state by endorsing Measure 1. Before you make up your mind, I'd like you to consider the benefits of Measure 1. The fact is, if we want to maintain our standard of living, if we want to compete economically and attract new investment, we must have good schools in this state. Measure 1 gives us a chance to secure the future for our schools with a simple 5% sales tax on goods only, not services. At the same time, Measure 1 gives those of us who own our own homes the property tax relief that we have asked for over the past 2 decades. Let me give you 3 good reasons to support the measure. Number 1, the sales tax receipts are dedicated to schools, elementary school through community college. If you're like me, you don't mind paying for something that you know is worthwhile. Measure 1 spends money on something that is very worthwhile and gives us real value. The money from the sales tax will go to public schools. Don't be confused. This is not more money for schools. The money raised by Measure 1 replaces most, but not all, of the revenue lost to schools through Ballot Measure 5. Without Measure 1, the dollars per student in this state will drop 14% from 1992 to 1995 on a per-student basis for schools. And that's without inflation. When you include inflation, it's a 25% reduction in a 3-year period. This is a 25% reduction in the purchasing power of your public schools over that 3 years. If you cut your schools and their purchasing power by that margin, they will not be the quality of schools we've had historically in this state. Measure 1, on the other hand, will provide stable, adequate, and equitable funding, allowing all schools to keep pace with student growth and inflation over the next decade. Our public schools need a stable, long-term funding base to assure that our students are prepared for the new world of work they will be facing in the next century. Measure 1 will meet that need. That's your main and first reason for supporting the measure. The second reason to support the measure is just as important. Measure 1 cuts homeowner property taxes big time. Real cuts, significant cuts next year. Under Measure 1, the portion of your homeowner property taxes that currently goes toward funding the operating expenses of your elementary secondary school district, your ESD, and your community college will reduce to 0. They will be eliminated. For example, if your home is valued at $100,000 this year, the $1,000 you're paying for operating elementary schools, community college ESDs will not be there next year. When you go home tonight, take a look at your most recent property tax bill. Look at the number that shows how much you're paying for school operating expenses. That will not be there if Measure 1 passes. That's real property tax release. And best of all, this relief is locked in the Constitution. The legislature can't change its mind. The only way it can be returned is if we change our mind at some future statewide election. The third reason to support Measure 1 is voter control. Unlike past sales tax proposal, Measure 1 is a sales tax that will be controlled by the voters. All the important features are locked in the Oregon Constitution. By putting these features in the Constitution, we're delivering a message. The voters are saying, legislature, we will tell you, we will control any changes we want made in this. You don't touch it. For example, the maximum 5% rate is locked in the Constitution. The legislature cannot raise it as they can in 44 of the other 45 states who have sales taxes. Only one other state controls the rate through their Constitution. The money has to go to schools. The legislature can't use it for anything else. The homeowner property tax cut is also, as I noted, written in the Constitution. No legislator or no future legislature can change that unless we, the people, decide it's okay. Other features that are locked in the Constitution include local sales taxes are banned. There's no sales tax on housing, groceries, utilities, prescription medicine, gasoline, or essential services. The legislature cannot change these features without our approval. And Measure 1 puts the sales tax on trial. After 5 years, if the promises made by those who are supporting this measure and by the legislators who developed it are not kept, if it isn't working the way they tell you it's going to work, it will stop unless you, the voters, decide to continue it. If this is successful on November 9th, the vote that day schedules another election in November of 1998 on exactly the same issue, the same language, and we must vote affirmative at that time to continue it. That's it. 3 reasons to support the measure. It's dedicated to schools, it cuts homeowner property taxes, and it puts voters in control. By endorsing Measure 1, the Portland City Club would join ranks with the Oregon Business Council, the Portland Chamber of Commerce, the Oregon Bankers Association, the American Electronics Association, and many other businesses that have already endorsed the measure. They understand the critical link between healthy schools and a healthy economy. They know Measure 1 is fair to business, good for schools, and fair to the taxpayer. Measure 1 has also been endorsed by the American Association of Retired Persons, the first time they've endorsed such a measure. Civics groups like the League of Women Voters, so has the School Boards Association and the Oregon Education Association, and so should the City Club. You have a long and well-earned reputation at City Club for responsible and thoughtful leadership. Let's take charge of our future and make sure we continue to have schools we can count on, schools we can be proud of. Let's show we care as much for our public schools and the children we send there as we do our roads. Does that mean I'm done, or I got 1 minute?
Yeah, no. Thank you very much,
I'm
Mr.
done.
Rose.
Thank you.
Mr. Sizemore, your opening statement.
Thank you. As I've been traveling the state, I've heard I've been against a lot of worthy opponents, such as Ozzie, and a lot of them have made this statement. I was hoping you'd make it for me, Ozzie, but you didn't, so I'll have to make it for you. A lot of people have said, there are problems with this measure, but it's the only game in town. And if we want to save our schools, this is our only choice. Well, it's not the only game in town. In fact, it's like there's this stadium full of people that are yes on one, that are waving pom-poms and trying to get everyone excited in making this choice. Either I am for a sales tax or I am against education. And the majority of voters in the state, taxpayers, have stayed home from that debate. And they have said, I'm against the sales tax. I'm for education. But, and I think this is a national cry, until you cut spending, no new taxes. Now, you can, if you believe in government and you want to fund government as much as possible, you may hate that message, but that message is out there. It's out there, very strong and powerful, and Don McIntyre didn't create that message, and I am not creating that message. That is what taxpayers in general are saying. This is the only game in town. I mean, let me talk about the measure just for a moment. No renter relief. There's homeowner tax relief, property tax relief, no renter relief. I'm a renter. I'll tell you, if it included renter relief, I would get renter relief. I would get property tax relief because I would go to my landlord and say, I want the property tax relief that you just got under Measure 1, or I'm moving. So Measure 1 is unfair to renters, but it's the only game in town. Spending limit. If you really want to put a spending limit in there to entice voters, especially voters like myself, that they can only increase spending if there's an emergency, then make it an emergency. Say 3/4 of the legislature has to agree that it's an emergency. 60%? That's 2 votes more than a simple majority in the Senate, 5 more in the House. That wouldn't take much of an emergency to get a group to override 60% when there's money there to spend and people crying for it. Thirdly, the 5%. I mean, this is probably anywhere you bring up a sales tax where they don't have a sales tax. What is the number one fear of the people? That it will rise. So wisely, they locked in the 5% into the Constitution so everyone could be told this 5% is the most it will ever be. But what does it mean to lock in 5% when you don't lock in the base? When they can tax services if they want to. The legislature, not the people. It's not in the control of the people. It's in the control of the legislature. They can tax services, whether it's your washing machine repair bill, your auto repair bill, your dentist bill, your orthodontist bill. They can tax it if they want without a vote of the people. So how safe are we when they can actually double the revenue that would come in under the sales tax, therefore double the cost to each one of us taxpayers simply with a vote of the legislature? That's like saying we could raise it to 10% if we want to. But it's the only game in town. Fourthly, and I think this is the biggest, because this is what the proponents have said this measure is about, education. Does Measure 1 provide a stable source of funding for schools. I mean, forget that you love schools and that you believe in public education and you want quality education for your kids. Just answer this simple question. Does Measure 1 provide a stable source of funding for schools? The answer is no. It doesn't. If it gave the schools all the money they needed to maintain their budgets at an acceptable level, you could say yes, if that money is dedicated to schools. But when it in fact only gives schools about 50% of the money that they currently need, and they still have to go back to the legislature for the other half, or maybe 40%, how are they different than they are now? The only difference is that there's now about $2 billion more in the general fund for the legislature to play with. If they want to give schools more money without Measure 1, they can. But if Measure 1 passes and the legislature chooses to, they can give the schools less money than they've ever had in the past. How much they will give, I don't know. But does Measure 1 do what they say it does? No, it does not. In fact, let me quote front page of the Oregon Public Employees Union newsletter for July-August. It says, I'm going to quote this, I'll be true to the essence of it. It says that Measure 1 provides about $2 billion for education, K through 14, or community college level, which will free up a similar amount of money in the general fund for other Oregon problems. Do you hear what I'm saying? I'm not speaking against education. I mean, I have 4 children. One of them's in public education, the other 3 are preschool. I want my kids to get a good education. But I can just see $2 billion coming into the state budget and it's gone. Well, how much will the schools get? I don't know. But the message of voters throughout this state, in fact, throughout this country, is we see too much waste in government. And I'll be specific about that if you wish in your questions. And until you can convince voters, taxpayers, that there has been real attempts to cut spending, to cut out government waste, you cannot expect us to say, okay, if it's for the kids, we'll give more anyway, even though you're treating the money we already gave you like monopoly money. And since I have 15 seconds to go and I've never finished speaking early, I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you, Mr. Sizemore. Now, during this portion of the program, each speaker will ask 2 questions of the other. The question must be asked in 15 seconds, and the other speaker will have 1 minute to respond, after which the questioner has the option of a 30-second rebuttal. Again, we'll look to Jolene to keep us on track. We'll begin with a question from Mr. Rose. Your first question, Mr. Rose?
Bill, my question starts you and the authors of Measure 5, but when I met you and found out how young you are, I'm not sure that you were involved in that, but
I'm 42.
the authors of Measure 5 in 1990 sold the measure as providing property tax relief and assuring us that no one would be taxed out of their homes. As you know, property taxes have dropped about $120 million since 1991, but the decrease has gone to business for the most part. Homeowners are paying about the same or more than they were in 91 and 92.
Your response? Yep.
Why would you not support a measure that gives tax relief to homeowners?
I would. If the net bottom line, Ozzie, was that this was a tax break, you wouldn't be after it. The fact of the matter is, I don't care if you're taking it out of me for my property tax or my sales tax. If I know for sure that the bottom line is this is going to cost me more money, then what difference does it make? I'd love to have lower property taxes, but I don't want it at the cost of a sales tax that costs me more than I gain.
Mr. Rose,
I
you have the
challenge
option to
you and
rebut.
everybody in the audience to go home and sit down and compute their property taxes will disappear with this against their spending habits, and most Oregonians will have a net gain in money in their pocket.
Mr. Sizemore, you have 15 seconds for your first question.
Okay. This is a little bit of a personal peeve. But Ozzie, during the Measure 5 campaign, the schools sent home tons of literature with kids telling them for their parents to vote no on Measure 1. And I have a desk full of the same for yes on Measure 1, where the kids are being used by schools to carry their literature to promote a political agenda. Do you think that's good, acceptable behavior? What would you do about that?
Well, if any youngster's packing home something that says vote for Measure 1, it's against the law, and you ought to do something about it.
You have an option to rebut, Mr. Sizemore?
I have actually filed a couple of complaints with the Secretary of State and threatened a couple of lawsuits, but the only problem is all I would do if I won is take money out of schools, and if they need it, I certainly don't want to take their money.
Mr. Rose, you have a chance for a second question of Mr. Sizemore. Again, 15 seconds.
In 1991, Oregon paid 12% of its personal income for local state governments. That ranked us 12th in the nation. If we fully implement the current law, which is Measure 5, we will drop to 46th in what we are investing in state and local governments. When we were at 12th, we spent on a per capita basis, we ranked 26th in state government, 30th in welfare, 29th in hospitals, 22nd in police, 17th in higher ed, and 15th in elementary and secondary education. If we drop from 12th to 46th, how do you view us as competing? Where will we fit with the rest of the states and what we provide in services in this state?
We need to keep our questions tight in
Would
order
you
to
repeat that question, please?
Just a short version.
No, I did understand it, because my answer won't be direct enough to need it repeated. It doesn't matter to me whether we are 20th in the nation, 46th in the nation, 5th in the nation. If taxes are too high everywhere, I think taxes are too high everywhere in the country. I think Americans, Oregonians, spend too much money on taxation. And as a result, it makes no difference to me where we place in relation to other states. If we're all heading off this cliff, I don't care if we're in the middle of the pack or the front of the pack, I don't want to go off it.
Your rebuttal, Mr. Rose? If you
That's
have
the easy
any?
side of the question. When are you going to sit down and show us how to cut the budgets to match what you think we ought to have in taxes and still have the livability and the services we want as a state?
Mr. Sizemore, your second question of Mr. Rose.
I think government lost a lot of credibility when they told voters that the sky would fall if we passed Measure 5 and that all the school teachers in Portland would get pink slips and that Barbara Roberts said people would die. And now we're being told that the schools will be devastated, Ozzie, if we don't pass Measure 1. The question is, real quickly here, how much does it cost? You tell us, how much does it cost to educate a child? What do you think is the realistic number, so we can just say, okay, we'll make that our target and we'll adjust it for inflation and increase enrollment. From now on, instead of shooting at this moving target, we'll know what the number is.
In 1992-93, the resources we provided on a statewide, on the average, about $4,400 per weighted student. What's laid out in terms of Measure 1 in the future is that number increased by inflation and student growth. That is not the level of spending we had prior to 91, but it does provide an adequate, long-term, stable base that will do the job. And we will not do it without passing the sales tax.
So what is the actual number that we can, in the future, adjust for inflation?
Is that your rebuttal?
Yes, that is my rebuttal. I wanted to, I can accept that as the number, that from now on we can adjust that for inflation and enrollment, and we have a fair, safe number.
$4,400+ on a weighted student basis.
Thank you very much. I think that concludes this portion of questions. And you can see the difficulty of kind of fitting into these time constraints, but we want to move along. We'll move to the portion of the program which consists of questions from our City Club panel. I'll turn the program over to our panelists, Joanne Allen and Dr. Francis Storrs. Each speaker will have 1 minute to respond to the question asked. The first question, Mr. Rose, will come from Joanne Allen.
Mr. Rose, won't adopting a sales tax have the effect of forfeiting a business advantage that Oregon enjoys over California and Washington?
The sales tax proposed in Oregon is lower than either of those. That yes, some folks may change their purchasing habits, but it'll work both ways. There's literature out that suggests winners and losers both sides of the river. It will not make a substantial difference in the economy in this state as compared to the current purchasing habits of the two states around us.
Fran, your question to Mr. Sizemore.
Mr. Sizemore, evidence is mounting that parents who can afford to are putting their children in private schools because of funding uncertainties, leaving public schools in the same situation as other deteriorating urban school systems around the country. Is this what you want to see happen?
I don't actually accept the premise. Because kids leave the public school, I suspect that my children will leave the public schools. It will not be because of funding. It will be because of lack of academic excellence in some schools. It will be because of violence, gangs. Seriously, that's the reason why I believe people are taking their kids out of public school.
Joanne, your question, Mr. Rose.
Mr. Rose, in almost all of the 46 states with a sales tax, their legislators simply enacted instead of referring it to the voters. Why didn't our legislators just use its authority and impose a sales tax?
Because our Constitution prohibits the legislature from enacting a piece of legislation that raises a tax or enacts a new one without allowing 90 days after the session adjourns for the people to refer it. And history of taxes in the last 30 years, the people would have referred it anyway, so you send it directly to the people rather than wait for the referral process.
Fran to Mr. Sizemore.
Mr. Sizemore, why shouldn't tourists help pay for Oregon's upkeep like they do almost everywhere else?
Well, I think they do. If you take, the proponents of Measure 1 are saying they're going to raise $50 to $100 million from tourists. Take that, that's 5% of the money, obviously, if it's a 5% tax, so take that times 20, and that's how much business is being pumped into Oregon's economy by out-of-state people. If we discourage those people, not only will we lose jobs, how many I don't know, but we will actually be affecting the tax base from which we are now paying taxes and the profits that corporations make, and et cetera, et cetera.
Joanne, your question to Mr. Rose.
Mr. Rose, our economic base is shifting from manufacturing and production to services. So why should goods be taxed and services get off scot-free?
Tax policy, you have to decide how much money you're trying to raise, what do you need, and then how to make it fair across incomes, et cetera, et cetera. In the debate over the sales tax, the issue of service was considered, and it was determined they didn't need to raise the level of money that you could raise with services, and they stuck with goods only.
Fran, your question to Mr. Sizemore.
Mr. Sizemore, it's easy to keep saying no more money until they cut government waste. Given that one person's waste is another person's necessity, would you be specific about where you think significant waste is?
I don't know if I can do that in 1 minute, but because I could go for a couple hours on that. But I'll tell you, the PERS initiative that I've written, I don't know if you want to call it waste or just excessive spending, but public employees in Oregon don't pay anything towards the cost of their pension benefits, which is around 15% to 16% of their salary. And public employees can roll over unused sick leave into the calculation of their pension benefit. The first of those, according to PERS, $625 million in the next biennium. The second one, $169 million we can afford to allow public employees to roll over 50% of their sick leave into their pension. And when the legislature says we have cut to the bones and they never considered education more important than public employees being able to roll $169 million in cost over to taxpayers into their pension, I don't buy that we have even attempted to cut.
Joanne, your question to Mr. Rose again.
Mr. Rose, schools claim they need more money, but property taxes are going up. Where's the money going?
Property taxes are going down. They're not going down on homes. I'm looking for the exact numbers, but over the 5-year period implement Measure 5, we're going to reduce the property taxes for schools by over $800 million. About half the property tax for schools will be gone. The total property tax is not going down at the same rate because it's constant in terms of other services and because assessed values have gone up. There's a significant loss in property taxes for schools. There is not the same level of loss for total property tax. That's the measure that I said earlier. Businesses have got what relief we've had. Total property tax haven't dropped much yet. They're going to drop a total of about 20% when this is all over. But the school portion is going to drop by over half.
Fran, Mr. Sizemore's question.
Mr. Sizemore, is there any tax that you would support?
None that I like, but there are taxes that I would support. I support an income tax, but I would like for the income tax to be, I'd like to see it cap out. When at our 9%, you don't reach there until at least 30 or 40,000. To have our income tax cap out at 10,000 bucks, you're considered rich enough to pay the maximum. I think that's absurd. Right now, I would say the first priority of government is cut spending. Convince the taxpayers. That's their money that we're spending. Convince them that we are using their money wisely and carefully. Then I think people are open to any kind of tax that is reasonable. I mean, I would support a sales tax if I was convinced that we needed the money, that we were actually being lean and efficient now, or even close to it. But right now, the perception is that government spends our money like it's monopoly money, and as long as that's the perception, no new taxes of any kind, period.
Thank you very much to our panel of questioners. Those were excellent. We're now going to open the debate to questions from the floor from City Club members only. We invite you to introduce yourself and ask a 15-second question directed to one speaker. There will be 1-minute responses. And I might ask Jolene to use her bell to keep us, since the questioners may not be able to see your cards, if you could use the bell. Now, questions from the microphone marked Pro to my right are to be addressed to Mr. Rose. Again, it's not what your position is, but if you want to address the Pro speaker, come to the right. Questions from the microphone marked Con to my left are to be addressed to Mr. Sizemore. We will alternate questioners, and so we will begin with a question for Mr. Rose. Mr. Westwood.
Jim Westwood, City Club member and public school parent. Stay the course with your children, Mr. Sizemore, please. This year, my children's schools have no new textbooks, no new library books. The children's bookstore in our neighborhood suffers as a result of not having the orders for that. The tutorial programs for slower learning children have been eliminated, and we have bought a couple of reams of paper for our school because they have no money. What more might we lose, Mr. Rose, if Measure 1 does not pass?
I'm not sure which school district you're in, but across the state, the level of cuts continue. The first cut is administration and supplies, et cetera. The next round of cuts are into the classroom deeper. We'll have fewer electives. We'll have larger classes. We'll have fewer kids having to go to school all day in high school because we want anything to offer them. We'll offer the bare minimum courses for graduation, and that's it.
Question for Mr. Sizemore.
Pete Bear, member. You alluded, and a number of your the people on your campaign alluded to the fact that the base can expand. The legislature can do that on a statutory basis. The constitutional spending limitation is also out there, and I'd like to see what kind of a magic formula you could propose to get 60% of each house to accept that spending addition and to get the governor to sign off on it. The only time they ever agree on anything is to adjourn.
They didn't do that all that quickly, actually. If I understand your question, you're basically saying that you think that 60% would be difficult to get, to override a spending limit. If I know anything about government, if there is a pile of money there that they have collected and they are not, and is available, there will be a fight to get it, a fight to spend it. And as a result, 60%, there will be a lot of pressure. I mean, why do we start all these programs? Because we supposedly need them. And they're all saying we're underfunded. Every program has a constituency that will fight for it. And if there's more money there, how do you say no to any of them? And will we override a 60%? I think it'll be as easy as falling off a log. Make it 75, 2/3, or 3/4 or 2/3, and I'd say you're being serious. 60%, I'd say you're being as easy on yourself as you could possibly be.
Question for Mr. Rose.
Mr. Rose, Isabel Hockett, Portland Public School parent. Mr. Rose, could you please explain for us the government spending limit that Measure 1 imposes?
Mr. Sizemore's already alluded to it. The government will not be able to spend from their combined revenues more than they spent the prior biennium, increased by population and inflation, unless they declare an emergency for a specific expenditure and override it by 60%. I disagree heartily with Mr. Sizemore. I've worked down there for 20 years. 60% vote in the House means that 25 folks against it can stop it, There are never fewer than 10 and usually 15 of them that come down there with a specific purpose of not spending a dime. You're going to have to only convince 10 out of a group of about 50 that it's not a good idea to override a spending limit voted on by the state. All of the people in the state voted for it. You want to go home and tell the folks you voted to do that? It will be very difficult to override.
Question for Mr. Sizemore.
Gail Johnson, City Club member. I equate taxes with services. Could you please explain how you would reduce services, since you think there's plenty of room to cut, in order for us to reduce the taxes? I know that money we collect goes to roads. What would you identify as services that we could cut?
I'm not so concerned about immediately cutting services. I feel like I'm beating up on public employees today, and that's not my goal, because I believe there are the majority of them are sincere, dedicated, hardworking people. But I think the perception is, and that I have it as well, is that there are simply too many people to do the work that they have to do. Now, in some particular agencies, they're understaffed. But a general perception is that most agencies have way more people. And I've worked with the government and for the government a few times in my life, and I have been amazed at the overabundance of people with nothing to do. And I mean, I'm not saying that they're not good people. I'm saying that we have too many of them. And the public is saying we cannot afford this many of them. Less public employees. Before we even start talking about less services, I believe a lesser number can actually produce the same level of services.
Question for Mr. Rose.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. Mr. Rose, undoubtedly there have been cuts in the public schools already, and whether we discuss the merits of what was cut and what was not cut, there have been some cuts. I'm interested in your elaborating a little bit on the automatic sunset or expiration provision and the need to reconfirm the tax in 5 years. It seems to me that that's a very important feature. We really don't know how it's going to work, but it automatically will expire or needs to be reconfirmed. Is this correct? Am I?
Measure 1 is a temporary tax. It expires June 30, 1999, unless the people of Oregon vote to continue it in November of 1998, period.
Question for Mr. Sizemore.
I'm Herb Crane, a member. I'm going to agree with you that there's a great deal of waste in government, and it's frustrating to the taxpayers. Nonetheless, when we cut on the budget certain aspects of the government, we leave the same people, or a large fraction of those people, running the same government. How then does that eliminate the waste in government?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand your question. I don't know, I lost you somewhere in there.
Would you
Yeah,
care to restate briefly, Herb?
yes. By eliminating certain, let's take schools alone. By eliminating certain expenditures in the schools, 5%, 10%, we leave the remaining untouched. And the same degree of waste would appear to exist in what remains as was always there. That doesn't make sense to me to be a waste-cutting tactic.
If you just cut some percentage, you have just saved money right there. And if there's waste in what is left, then that just means that there's room for more cuts. But have you saved money when you have cut waste? Yes, you have. Could you go deeper? Probably. I don't know how deep you cut the first time. There has to be some priority in cutting, obviously. And wherever you cut, some people aren't going to like it. But can you cut? I would do it, and if anybody wants to sit down with me, I will show you. I have a long list of things where I would start.
Question for Mr. Rose.
Ken Brody, City Club member. Mr. Rose, since the total stream of collections of taxes will be increased by Measure 1, and since the general fund will be relieved of educational expenditures to the extent of Measure 1 collections, would you agree with Mr. Sizemore's claim that the net bottom line effect of Measure 1 will be to increase money available to the general fund for other expenditures by about $2 billion.
I don't agree to the magnitude. The dedication of the money to schools, the commitment of the legislature to the equity issue, it does not free up $2 billion. It does cover the shortfall projected for 95-97. The irony of the argument about the fear that the legislature won't fund us with this money if we get it from the sales tax, that is an issue we created with the passing of Measure 5. We are a function of what the legislature does with or without the sales tax. We did that with Measure 5. We are a state-funded school system. The Ways and Means Committee will decide how much money we spend on schools with or without the sales tax. And the people who use the argument against the sales tax are the ones who proposed the measure in the first place in Measure 5. And now they come back and wail away the state won't take care of the schools. They took away local control. They turned over the issue to the legislature.
A question from Mr. Sizemore next.
Thank you.
A question for Mr. Sizemore?
Yes, Marilyn Couch, City Club member. Mr. Sizemore, my son presently attends Portland Public Schools. He's in the International Baccalaureate program. I don't think there is a program with such academic excellence anywhere in the metropolitan area within private schools. And this program with Portland, what Portland is facing in cuts in the next 2 years will most likely not exist. You want to take your children out of public schools because there's no academic excellence, or you don't feel there will be any. How do you expect schools to maintain academic excellence and to address the needs of all the children that they must accept without money?
I believe that your child, having achieved this excellence that they have achieved, is mostly as a result of you.
I'm sorry. I did not stay home with my
Do we have a
child.
question next for, would you have any more to say?
Yes,
I didn't mean to
yes,
interrupt.
I did.
I'm sorry.
That was
I
a
saw-
meaningful. That was a meaningful pause.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Newsweek magazine, hardly a bastion of conservative thought, said this year that in an article this year that over the past 25 years, no study has shown a meaningful correlation between spending on education and quality of education. And I mean, that's not my studies that I would find that would be slanted to support my diabolical position. That's across the board. Do we need to spend money on public education? Yes. But is the bottom line, is there a bottom line and we just say no matter what they say they need, that's how much we'll spend? Or do we have a point where we say,
A question from Mr. Rose. You can complete your
oh, that's all right.
sentence, yeah. It's not that exacting.
She was looking mean there for a moment.
A question for Mr. Rose.
I'm Gus Mattersdorf, a member of the City Club. Mr. Rose, how do you plan to deal with the development that sales tax receipts will be less stable than other tax receipts? Property tax comes in quite evenly year after year after year. Income tax comes in relatively evenly. Sales tax depends very heavily on how much business is being done in a particular week or a particular month. And I worry that the receipts of the state from the sales tax will be very uneven and will might lead to further stringencies. How do you deal with that?
If you're telling me that that sales tax is less stable in property, I knew that when I voted against Measure 5. I don't have any choice now but to use the consumption tax or the sales tax because we as a state have decided not to use the property tax for this purpose. It is not as good as the property tax for the reasons stated, but that doesn't happen to be one of our alternatives any longer.
Question for Mr. Sizemore.
My name's Courtney Volker, and I'm here with Youth Today. My generation are the people that are being affected by this directly. And we need money very badly in our schools. And if Measure 1 is not the answer, then in your opinion, what is? Or in your words, what are the other games in town?
I think the answer goes back to this basic premise We send so many billions of dollars down to Salem, and they prioritize what to spend them on. How important are you to the legislature? I mean, the last session, there were plenty of kids down there waving their banners and saying, we need money for our schools. I mean, I thought the message was well presented to the legislature. But again, they chose to cut school funding ahead of public employees' sick leave rollover, $170 million. How? I think you have a legitimate, you should be lobbying saying we need money for our schools. But you don't need to lobby me. I am on your side. But just because this is the only game in town doesn't mean I have to say, okay, well, we give up. The legislature did a lousy job, so we'll just keep giving them more money. And they can use it however they want. Because that's what I believe will actually happen with Measure 1.
I see one person standing. Before I ask you to ask a question, in the event there aren't others who wish to line up, I might ask the panel to step in should there be no other people to the microphone. But would you address your question to Mr. Rose, please?
Connie Powell, City Club member. Question to Mr. Rose. This week, the Oregonian published a survey of ranking 300 American cities in terms of providing a qualified employee pool for businesses. Seattle ranked 4th in this survey, no Oregon City ranked. How do you see the decrease in education funding for primary and secondary education affecting the pool of qualified students entering college?
I think the answer to that's pretty self-evident, and I tried to say that in my opening remarks. Our future economy depends upon a well-educated workforce, and we are no longer cutting trees. We are changing the kind of economy we have. And if we want to compete internationally and with the rest of this country, we have to have a well-educated workforce. We have to keep our own children home. I indicated I had 3 grown children with U of O degrees. 2 of them are in another state. We have to keep them here. We won't do that if we don't invest in education.
A question for Mr. Sizemore.
Yes, John Lamb with Youth Today. Earlier you stated that if you put your kids in private schools as opposed to public, it would be because the public schools don't give enough, don't have a high enough academic standard, and not because of the lack of money. But don't you think that's a reverse of causality, that
I think I get your point.
Okay.
My kids mean more to me than saving public schools. Don't you agree that that should be the priority? I mean, I'm not going to send my kids to the public schools if I think the public schools are bad for them to save the public schools.
Next question, then? Are we on to?
Yeah, that's good.
Wasn't sure if that was another pregnant pause.
Yeah.
Question for Mr. Rose.
Yes, City Club member. Could you please explain to me how this is an equitable tax for renters?
The renter will get the relief that Mr. Sizemore says he's going to get. He'll demand it. I assume he's already done it because wherever he's renting, the taxes should have gone down a little bit with Measure 5 on a piece of business property, and they're going to go down more with when Measure 5 goes into the $5. There is no direct relief out of sales tax. That's true. Supply and demand should drive, the market should drive rents down with what Measure 5 does for rental property. And the legislature debated that issue. And the balance between what's paid by business property and households, they came down on that side of handling that way.
Question for Mr. Sizemore.
Yes, my name is Mark Shuford. I'm a City Club member. Mr. Sizemore, you've stated that you have a long list of items that you feel can be cut as a waste in government. Instead of addressing these issues in this type of forum, why don't you run for governor so you can make some decisions a little higher up?
Will you support me?
Probably not.
Well, I got to get at least one supporter besides my wife before I can do that.
Let me see your list.
I will be happy to meet with you, Ozzie, and I will show you that list. It's 2 pages long, single space.
I think we have time for one more round of questions from the floor. A question for Mr. Rose, and then we'll go to concluding statements after a question to Mr. Sizemore.
Hi, I'm Jane Beerworth, a City Club member. This is for Ozzie Rose. What will happen to House Bill 3565, the CATS plan, if Measure 1 does not pass?
House Bill 35, thank you for calling me Ozzie. I'm more comfortable than Mr. 3565 is our school improvement effort. Our school improvement effort will continue. It'll be slowed down to beat the band if we don't have resources to do it. We want things done better. We want teachers to teach differently. We want them to be more effective. Oh, but by the way, we don't want to provide any resources to give them any time to learn how to do that. Industry wants to change something. They train their workforce. They take them out of work and train them. They do something. We will not be able to do that. We'll talk about improvement. We'll be very slow at making it happen, but it will not stop totally.
Final question for Mr. Sizemore from the floor.
Eric Fishman, City Club member. You've been asked this question a couple of times, but I haven't felt like I've got an answer to it. And that is specifically, you say people are leaving the public schools because they feel that there's not academic excellence, and they're concerned about safety, and they're concerned about the quality of facilities in the buildings. And then you say, but that's not because they're concerned about funding. And I want you to tell me, do you honestly believe that there is no connection between funding and quality of academic excellence, facilities, and safety?
For the most part, that's exactly right. I don't believe in a dilapidated school, obviously. I don't live in a dilapidated home. I wouldn't want to send my children to a dilapidated school. I didn't say I would take my kids out of school because of the buildings. I spoke more about the atmosphere itself not being conducive to learning. And I think that's an advantage that private schools have over public schools, is that they have the ability to control atmosphere more strictly than public schools do. There's a lot more discipline in private schools. And I think that they achieve a higher level of academic excellence for less money, because they don't have all the programs that the public schools have to carry. Because they have, well, I could go into it for a long time, but I'd like a chance sometime, if I get another opportunity, to address this whole question of school choice and the competition factor. But I don't have time now.
I think that closes this portion of our program. I want to thank City Club members, and particularly the Youth Today group, for speaking up and asking some very good questions of our speakers. We'll now move to the final portion of our program, two-minute closing statements from each speaker. We'll maintain the same order for closing statements that followed throughout, and begin with Mr. Rose, concluding with Mr. Sizemore. Mr. Rose.
This format of trying to discuss taxes and spending, et cetera, in a 2-minute and 1-minute kind of thing is very, very difficult. I'm more comfortable in an hour-and-a-half dialogue and sit down and talk it over. You're forced to respond to short comments that need more elaboration. Key thing Mr. Sizemore just said, public schools have to carry. He mentioned programs that public schools have to carry. Keep that in mind in the future when you talk about what you want to do with your schools. We keep hearing that government spends too much money, the legislators simply haven't gotten the message. But what is that message? They didn't cut. They cut out of schools. How much of their budget's in schools to start with? They didn't have very many choices. There's only been 2% real growth on a per-student basis in education over the last 15 years in this state, in our elementary and secondary schools. That's a 15-year period in which society and parents sent to those schools gangs and gang members we didn't have in the middle 70s, more drug babies, latchkey kids, 50,000 kids who go home after school every day in this state with no supervision, kids who probably aren't doing homework. These things have to be addressed. You don't address them by taking away the resources the schools currently have. And you don't say, wow, government spend. There are fewer state policemen in this state than there were in 1980. Government isn't wasting that much money. They should do some things different, and they must do them better. No argument. But the kind of cut we're being asked to make isn't there. And the proponents telling us we have to cut it have never sat down and tried to deal with it. All they've looked at is, that's too much tax, we can cut it. Now you guys figure out a way to do it better. Sit down and come to the table and try to make it work. Thank you for letting me speak with you this afternoon, and make no mistake about it. The election on November 9th is about adequate funding for schools. It's not about taxing potato chips. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Mr. Sizemore? Mr. Sizemore, your concluding statement, please.
Is it 3 minutes?
2.
2? Okay. So where are we going to go from here? What's the future hold for us? You know, there are some ballot measures that are definitely going to be on the ballot in 1994. The PERS initiative that I wrote and I'm a chief petitioner on will be on the ballot in 94. And that has an opportunity to save government statewide about $800 million according to PERS's own figures, Public Employees Retirement System. That's what I mean when I say PERS. That will be on the ballot. You'll be offered the opportunity to decide whether that $800 million could be spent better or more fairly elsewhere. There's another initiative that I think you should be aware of if you're not already, called the Taxpayer Protection Initiative. And it basically says the government cannot raise any taxes or any fees without a vote of the people. It's coming. I think, you know, this group may not be particularly representative of all of society, but I think you, in your contacts out there in your daily life, you are meeting this same message yourself all the time. People are concerned about government. They're concerned about the level of spending. I think what we need in the future, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to elect officials who will say, if this is what the people want, this is what I will have to do, whether I like it or not. I will roll up my sleeves and I will cut. They will have to make some choices that are hard. But unless they do that, they are not going to restore the lack of faith that taxpayers have in their government today. That's coming. I see it. That's the future. Less taxes, less government waste. Convince us of that, and we will fund every government program we believe in to the fullest extent necessary. But until we see that, we will put limits on government until we can trust them to use our money carefully and wisely, because it's not an unlimited source. Taxpayers out there are saying, I just can't afford it anymore. Thank you.
On behalf of City Club, I'd like to thank Ozzie Rose and Bill Sizemore for illuminating the sides of this debate. I invite City Club members back next week for our own debate on a research report delivered in your bulletins today. We are adjourned.